politics of international intervention. When, where, how and why do states and IOs intervene in ethnic conflicts? What is their track record? A 42-minute presentation held in the Nelson Lecture Theatre at the Joint Services Command Staff College, Shrivenham, on the 23rd of June 2006. The speaker is Dr. Stephen Wolfe, a Professor of Political Science at the University of Bath. This presentation is the third of 4 dealing with international intervention in ethnic conflicts. Please note that there are some references to the visual aids that were used during the presentation. Dr. Stephen Wolfe.
Where I left it off 2 weeks ago was basically trying to argue that even though there is quite a lot of instruments and mechanisms around now that can help us address the kind of ethnic conflicts that I have dealt with in the first 2 lectures, there still every once in a while are questions whether international intervention is the right thing to do and whether it's really necessary and can get us to a stage where we can have at least violence cease and potentially then move towards a much more stable and peaceful environment. So the need for international intervention, just to pick up where I left it off then, I think has mostly to do with 2 particular dimensions. The first one, I would say, really is local capacities, or rather lack thereof, in conflict and sometimes post-conflict environments. And what basically you have in most of these cases is that political, economic, human resources and capacities are very often diminished as a consequence of conflict. So people basically can shoot relatively well, but what they cannot necessarily do is run an economy, run any basic form of government and administration and so on and so forth. A second point which struck me a couple of years ago when I was working in the Western Balkans, and that's why I also put Bosnia and Herzegovina here as the example, is that very often you have a lack of capable leaders in these situations that are willing and able to prevent further or future violent escalation of their conflict or to lead the transition from violence to peace. Very often what you get is people who have risen to leadership positions in wartime or in times of hate and violence, but they are very often unable and in many cases unwilling to actually lead the people that they claim to represent into a future that would be one without violence and more one in which political institutions and processes matter. Now, talking about institutions, these are normally lacking as well. In particular, strong institutions are usually not around. And what is also more striking in a sense is that very often you don't also have the local capacity actually to operate institutions. What I always found astonishing is that international mediators suggest or coerce people to sign up to very, very complex peace deals which require them to build institutions that sometimes look more complicated than the Belgian model, and then expect that they can basically take the next plane out of the place and people will be able to operate a complex federal system, deal with matters of decentralization, financial devolution and so on and so forth. So I think if it is necessary to have relatively complex agreements in order to get all the parties signed on to a peace deal, what is also necessary in terms of international intervention is actually to have people there who can help run institutions and build local institutional capacity to enable the local parties to operate these institutions. And then the final point is very often that there is a lack of economic resources to provide incentives against violent escalation or perpetuation of violence. And one of the few areas in which the European Union and its predecessor organizations actually did have an impact in Northern Ireland was through the so-called EU Peace Programme, which did exactly that. It provided relatively large amounts of funds to Northern Ireland to enable people basically find jobs that would prevent them from practicing and exercising various violent options, but also that began to build an economic situation in which people gradually realized that it was more beneficial to them actually to stick to relatively non-violent, peaceful means rather than sort of continue operating in ways that had proven more or less successful for many of them also in economic terms in the past. So local capacities or lack thereof, I think, is the first area in which, if one looks at it, one could justify the need for international intervention. And then the second one, which I think is equally important and in some cases even more important, at least in the short term after a ceasefire has been established, is that the international community usually is the only believable and credible and trusted party to provide security guarantees that will enable the local conflict parties to lay down their arms and gradually begin to think about demobilization, disarmament, and eventually reintegration of their fighters into society. And the reason why this is the case is that most conflicts, either in their origin or at some point during the various stages of the conflict, are situations which could be described as security dilemma. And that basically means that in order to increase your own security as a group, any action that you are taking is basically perceived as a threat to the security of the other group. If you think about this just in terms of the weaponry that is usually around in these conflicts, if I increase my security by buying an AK-47, for example, you don't know necessarily that I will only use that to defend myself, but I could just as well sneak out at night, come to your house, shoot you and your family, and take all your various goodies out of your house. So because there is no such thing as a purely defensive weapon, and certainly not in many of the conflict situations that I've made reference to in the past, it's very difficult actually for parties to believe and to trust, especially after sometimes decades of very bloody civil war, that they can now fully commit to a political process and that they won't be taken advantage of by their erstwhile opponents and enemies. And that's why various peacekeeping operations, or peace support operations, I think is the correct terminology, are very often important to make the conflict parties comfortable in a political setting that helps them to gradually overcome the problems that led to the conflict in the first place. And just to give you some examples, I mean, the Western Balkans was a very strong example for that. In the beginning, there were more than 100,000 troops in Bosnia and Herzegovina just to basically separate the party after they had signed the Dayton Peace Agreement. But Bosnia also shows that this is not necessarily a commitment that has to go on at this level for decades and decades. Now, 10 years after the Dayton Peace Agreement was signed, we are basically down to, I think, about 6,200 troops, mostly now EU troops or under an EU mission. So, in a sense, NATO, as the probably more credible fighting force, is itself no longer involved. Then I left Aceh on here as an example. Here, sort of security guarantees are mostly provided through a monitoring mission. So the European Union has its first Asian or sort of Far Eastern operation going on in this province of Indonesia by providing a monitoring service to ensure that the ceasefire between the Free Aceh movement and the government of Indonesia is kept. And in the Solomon Islands, the Australians have been the lead nation on several occasions to ensure that there is a sufficient and sufficiently strong and robust international peacekeeping presence to ensure that the Solomon Islands can make a transition towards a more peaceful future. Now, given that there is international intervention, and I certainly for the most part am a strong advocate of international intervention, the next question that we need to ask then is, so what actually determines whether an intervention takes place and how it takes place and whether it will be successful? There are basically four questions I think that one needs to ask. First of all, who does the intervening? So who is it actually that decides that they want to go into a particular conflict situation? What kind of mandate do they have? Is it authorized by the UN Security Council? Is it just a regional mission, and so on and so forth? Also, very often important here is what is actually the agenda of the intervening party. Is it really what they say on paper, that they just want to bring peace, democracy and prosperity to a particular country? Or do they have agendas of their own that may not always be quite as benign as they make out. One example that I'm thinking of here is Russian peacekeepers in the Commonwealth of Independent States. So, for example, if you think of South Ossetia in Georgia, I'm not so sure that peace, prosperity and democracy is necessarily the first item on the agenda of the Russian presence there. Second question is, how does intervention actually work? Now, we have had a fair share of military interventions over the past decade and a half, but this is obviously not the only way in which international intervention can occur. And in fact, I would argue if we look at the broad range of international involvement in various ethnic conflicts, military intervention actually is probably one of the smaller occurrences or smaller numbers of ways in which intervention occurs. Lots of things do still happen primarily diplomatically. So there's very often a lot of direct and indirect pressure being exercised, facilitation being offered, mediators being sent to different conflicts, financial aid, development aid, but also sanctions and embargoes sometimes are being used in order to create a situation in which conflict parties on the ground would basically do what they would otherwise not have done, namely what the international community, so to speak, wants them to do. So make peace, put down your guns and find a solution that emphasizes political rather than military aspects. The next question is, where does the intervention actually happen? So what kind of society? Is it sort of a democratic society where the democratically elected government actually has asked for military intervention or any other kind of intervention? Or is it a situation where the intervention really occurs into an all-around hostile environment, where neither of the conflict parties is particularly interested, where the government does not extend an open invitation to international involvement, let alone peacekeepers and so on and so forth. So Sudan, for example, is quite an interesting example here, because the government of Sudan has been quite happy to accept the help of international mediators in the various conflicts that have been going on in the country, literally left, right and center over the past 30 years, but has been very, very reluctant to invite United Nations peacekeeping forces or African Union peacekeeping forces in the country. So this also then means that sometimes the international community can make use of some instruments of intervention, but not others. And the question then is, to what extent will such more limited interventions always be useful and successful in bringing about the desired ends that the international community has? And then the final question is, when does intervention occur? Do you actually get in there before you have a bloody civil war with tens or hundreds of thousands of people killed and displaced? Or is it that you really wait until the dying days of the war, when more or less conflict parties are so exhausted that all they need is a little bit of a nudge, and immediately they will sit down at the negotiating table and pretty much sign whatever you put in front of them. And that, I think, is also quite important in terms of thinking more long-term about the future of intervention. One of the critical capabilities that very often is still missing at various levels in the international community is really to have credible early warning intelligence that can tell you a conflict is going to erupt very soon if we don't do X, Y, and Z. So I think in a way, if there is going to be put more emphasis on this kind of long-term monitoring of particular situations, it will be easier to have early interventions which will be less costly for all sides and are more likely to be successful than having to wait, as in the case of, say, East Timor, for example, or Western Balkans or Sudan, where it was really only after years, if not decades, of extreme violence that eventually an international intervention succeeded. What then are the approaches to intervention, and how can we classify them in terms of the spectrum of intervention options that are available to the international community? Now, I already said this depends very much on the stage of the conflict. So do you intervene pre or post violent escalation? So in Bosnia and Herzegovina, it was very much after the civil war had already started and was in full swing that really robust, strong intervention occurred. In Kosovo, arguably you could say that there was a hell of a lot of tension and sporadic acts of violence, but that the intervention happened, and the intervention itself then may have triggered the mass violence and the mass displacement, in particular of ethnic Albanians, that occurred in the first several months of NATO's campaign against Serbia. And Macedonia, I think, presents a case where intervention happened so early that you basically had a little bit of violence in 2000 and 2001, but by no means anything on the scale of Kosovo and or Bosnia and Herzegovina. So here really this was much more of a successful case of prevention, of a preventative intervention, rather than sort of fighting fires once they have broken out. Now, character of society, I think, very important. Look at Somalia. Complete collapse of the state, no functioning government. So if you then intervene into a situation where knowledge of local culture and customs and the actual hierarchies in society is relatively limited, then you're in a way likely to encounter the kind of resistance and in the end the kind of disasters that the American-led UN intervention in Somalia in the early 1990s had. Sudan, slightly different example here. Relative openness of the government, as I said, to diplomatic interventions, but complete blocking at the moment of anything that would resemble a peacekeeping force. In Solomon Islands, they are really, in a way, the Australians as a sort of a Pacific Islands group that is sort of a regional organization similar to the African Union or to ASEAN or to the EU to some extent. They really invited the Australians in and made sure that they did have appropriate knowledge, appropriate capabilities, and that I would argue was a relatively successful intervention. Also important is the nature of the conflict parties and their various decision-making systems. So in Chechnya you can't really intervene because the Russians don't want you to, and the Russians are too big to be taken on and taught a lesson or two about human rights and conflict resolution. On the other hand, if you look at Northern Ireland, there the British government, rightly or wrongly, also has always resisted any kind of international involvement in the conflict in Northern Ireland, and Britain was one of the strongest advocates of very specific regulations for cases in which the OSCE High Commission on National Minorities could be involved, namely excluding all cases of domestic terrorism. And that basically has precluded for a very long time the High Commissioner taking any active part in the situation in Northern Ireland. Then a third example, which sort of is again at a different extreme, would be Democratic Republic of Congo, where basically the area in which intervention was most needed was so far away from the capital, Kinshasa, and was basically totally unconnected to any kind of government infrastructure that, nobody particularly cared. Problem, of course, was that you had lots and lots of neighboring countries around that took advantage of exactly that situation. In the end, the DRC was the scene of what some people call Africa's First World War, where you had 8 neighboring countries and their armies at one point or another fighting it out in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and the still very, very volatile eastern part of the country. There has been a civil war since 1998 with about 3 million people killed. Significant involvement in particular from Uganda, Burundi and Rwanda, and only gradually United Nations and at one point in 2003 sort of a gap-bridging mission of the European Union that have tried to restore some resemblance of a normal life to these parts in the DRC. And finally, the character of the third parties themselves who are involved, I think is quite interesting, because that again also allows us to determine the nature and the likely success of the intervention. So what capabilities do they have? What leverage over the conflict parties can they actually exercise? How are they linked to conflict parties? What is their level and type of interest, and how much are they actually able to sustain interventions over a long period of time? So just look at the examples here. So the UN, European Union, African Union, Organization of the Islamic Conference, all very different agendas, very different capabilities, very different types of intervention that they are willing to carry out. And if you look at individual countries, I mean, US, Russia, China, Australia, the differences in some way couldn't be greater between them. China is not, or has not until recently been active as a peacemaker or warmonger or whatever you want to call it, but has increasingly become interested in a number of conflicts which are in one way or another related quite closely to Chinese energy interests. So China unfortunately has not played a very good role in the situation in Sudan, because Sudan is one of the big oil and gas suppliers for the People's Republic. And obviously China does not in any way want to endanger its relationship with Sudan. So Sudan, at least for the time being, can rely on a Chinese veto in the Security Council when it comes to UN peacekeepers, for example. Now, what do countries in the West basically do about intervention? So if we take it a little bit back to our own hemisphere, so to speak, there's basically two different approaches. One is called hard realism, and on the next slide you have then the obvious opposite, which is soft realism. Now, hard realism would say you really don't want to intervene anywhere unless vital security interests are concerned. This is very much what happened under Bush Sr., the first Clinton administration, and I would say the second administration of George Bush Jr. And the options that the sort of hard realists propose here are things that aren't really that pleasant if you think of them implemented on the ground. So partitions usually don't work in the long term. So one of the big things that the Americans proposed relatively early on in the Bosnia conflict was just carve up the country, divide it into a Croat, a Bosniak and a Serbian part, and then that's it. So going along with that, obviously, you will also have endorsed or at least not actively prevented ethnic cleansing. So the unmixing of populations, in particular in the border areas of these three proposed states. To some extent you have a similar discussion, or had a similar discussion among some circles, both in academia as well as in policy areas in the United States, about Iraq. Just split Iraq into three, have Shia South, Kurdish North, and a relatively weak Sunni center. Again, I personally would have my doubts that this works. Another option that hard realists favor is containment. So all you really want to do at best is prevent a spillover of one conflict into other areas, in particular into areas which might be more vital to your own security interests. And then the third one is that you basically want to favor your own side in the conflict by shipping arms, finances, any other kind of support to your side in the conflict, or apply selectively boycotts and sanctions. So this is a relatively passive approach that considers intervention purely from the perspective of what is good for the intervener himself. Example here, Bosnia and Herzegovina before the summer of 1995. So you had all kinds of either crazy suggestions, in my view, or very, very unhelpful policies. So the arms embargo, for example, that was imposed on all of the former Yugoslav states, essentially favored the Serbs, because the Serbs were the ones who had access to all the former National People's Army of Yugoslavia. So they had all the military hardware, and it was increasingly or incredibly difficult in the beginning for Croats and Bosniaks actually to acquire useful military hardware on the international market. This obviously changed then in summer 1995 after the shelling of the market in Sarajevo, when under American leadership there really was a much more active interpretation of the UN mandate that had existed since 1993. Now, soft realism is a position that I find myself much closer to personally. Default position here is that conflict and instability are security threats regardless where they occur. So it is always in your interest to make sure that you have basically a world of stability rather than sort of the occasional conflict here or there that may not be immediately a threat to your own interests, but that can potentially, of course, become one. And soft realists do regard intervention as a necessary foreign policy tool and are also not afraid to use it. And again, by intervention I do not only mean sending the troops and the bombs. Now, options available, therefore, are much bigger as well. So you have mediation, coercive diplomacy, peacemaking, confidence building, and so on and so forth. And soft realists are also the people who basically sort of favor power sharing and wealth sharing solutions, and who usually have options available as well to deal with spoilers of particular peace agreements, either by eliminating them from the process, so you basically arrest them and send them to international criminal tribunals, or you buy them off, send them somewhere in exile and make sure that they don't cause any problems anymore. Clinton 2, Bush Jr. 1, and the European Union, I think, would be the best examples here. Bosnia after summer 95, as I already said, but also Kosovo and to some extent Macedonia, if we want to stay in the Western Balkans here, would be the, I think, appropriate cases to cite. Now, with all of this in mind, what is actually the kind of intervention that we are getting on the ground? And I have to warn you, the first couple of pictures are not particularly pretty. Because very often what you get is failed interventions, where something somehow has not fully worked out as the planners had envisaged. And then you get situations like the massacre in Srebrenica, where Bosnian Serbs massacred more or less under the eyes of a Dutch peacekeeping contingent. Various figures here between 7,000 and 8,000 Muslim men over the age of 16. You also get abandoned interventions. Rwanda, genocide, 8 months, kills about 1 million people. There was a UN force in the country and had been there for quite some time at the beginning of the genocide. It was not deemed robust enough, not strong enough, and was gradually withdrawn, knowing full well what the consequences of that would be. You also get delayed interventions, as in the case of Sudan. Darfur, the problems there started in 2003, but really came to the full attention of international media in 2004, and it took until, I think, 2 or 3 weeks ago that a peace agreement was finally signed. But the signing of the agreement has not meant in any way that you have any situation resembling non-violence or peace at the moment. And the government of Sudan, as I said earlier, still resists the deployment of international peacekeepers actually to enforce or to monitor the holding of the ceasefire. And then you get non-interventions, as in the case of Chechnya, which are also not particularly happy occurrences. And there are lots and lots of human rights organizations that have reported on Chechnya, but for various obvious reasons, nobody is really doing much except for sometimes wagging a finger at President Putin and saying, well, you really shouldn't do that in Chechnya, but that's really the most that happens there at the moment. Now the question is, why is that going on? Isn't there any kind of learning process? Don't sort of the decision makers realize that these things really shouldn't happen late 20th, early 21st century? Now, I think there are 3 factors that are related to things missing. The first one is lack of resources. Sometimes there's not enough money, not enough troops, equipment, projection capabilities, intelligence around really to conceive of an intervention force that would be, or of an intervention, more broadly speaking, that would have a chance of success. Sometimes it's really that it's an area so remote that you really don't know what's going on. But very often it's also that there's not the right equipment, there's not enough money to facilitate mediation and negotiation efforts. And as in the case of Rwanda, for example, there have been some relatively good analyses that have shown that even if an intervention had happened much earlier on, probably still about 500,000 people would have been killed, because the projection capabilities were to some extent missing. There was also not the local infrastructure around actually to bring enough troops in quickly enough in order to stop the killing. But this spread relatively quickly within the first month beyond the capital of Rwanda and into the more rural areas. The second thing that is very often missing is sustained commitment. The CNN factor here works both ways. It first energizes the international community to do something, whatever that something might be, but then news media attention moves on. So you have a conflict here today, but then next week you have an earthquake, so everybody moves on with the earthquake, and then things drop from the news agenda, and once they're off the news agenda, there's no longer, in a lot of cases, sufficient pressure on governments actually to do something. When was really the last time that before British troops were killed in Afghanistan, you had heard anything about Afghanistan in the media? Nothing for months. Iraq, still top of the media, but Afghanistan, for about a year prior to that, there was very, very little coverage going on. So that's the sort of counter effect of the CNN factor. And then the other thing, obviously, is the body bag syndrome. And the classic example here is Somalia, where a relatively well-equipped, well-mandated force in the end was withdrawn after a number of American soldiers had been killed in rather cruel circumstances. And then the third point is lack of leadership in the intervening countries. There sometimes domestic policy agendas dominate foreign policy agendas. So normally you don't go to war just before an election, or you do go to war before an election in order to distract people from whatever domestic misery there is. But as soon as domestic agendas begin to dominate what you do in terms of your foreign policy, in particular in terms of interventions, then I think there is always a serious problem here that leaders will do what essentially preserves their ability to retain power, rather than what sort of I as an academic would deem as the right and proper thing to do. And then there are two other factors here, which is that you sometimes have overriding national interest. At the moment in the US, probably everything is being dominated by the war on terror. So sometimes you also choose not to intervene, or you choose to intervene on the wrong side, because, for example, an incumbent government is relatively friendly towards you. It allows you to have bases in the country. It helps you with intelligence, with the extraction of information. Maybe you can park some people that you held captive somewhere. You can leave them there, and maybe the security services of, I don't know, Egypt or Pakistan do the dirty work for you and get information from these people. So you then would, under these circumstances, not necessarily want to engage with this government over potential human rights violations and so on and so forth. So once there's an overriding national interest, there are very often good cases to be made and reasonable cases to be made why intervention in a particular conflict simply is not useful from the perspective of the national interest at the time. And then you have very often conflicting agendas, and in particular in countries where there is not a very strong tradition of foreign policy continuity or continuity in terms of civil service bureaucracy, and in particular I'm thinking here of the United States, where you have Clinton too, who has been for a long time the most interventionist American president, and you end up with George Bush Jr., and then it's all isolationist. And then the election platform, to some extent, that Bush has was really we shouldn't do anything about anything that is not core American interests. So I think this also then means that you have sometimes very, very erratic and unpredictable policies that some of the more important countries, the great powers in the international system, display in terms of how they relate to intervention into ethnic conflict. Now, there are, of course, also some success stories. I don't want to leave you completely depressed, but you see that I have a question mark there, so I just don't want to be too overly optimistic here. I think Kosovo still does count as a success story and will remain a success story, probably even when the province will eventually become independent from Serbia. So that was, in my recollection, one of the last cases where NATO troops were greeted with flowers on the streets, and where you still in Pristina in Kosovo have a Bill Clinton boulevard with a huge oversized poster of Clinton just when you drive in from the airport. Macedonia, I think, also a success story. Here you see President Tchaikovsky on the right, not quite sure what he is doing there, but he's certainly engaging with Javier Solana and George Robertson. And I think the guy in the back here, but I'm not entirely sure, is the EU representative, another EU representative, Stefan Lehner. These three basically impressed on Tchaikovsky that the so-called Ohrid Agreement of 2001 would be a really good thing for him to endorse, and he did, and major violence was prevented in Macedonia in 2001. Here you have Martti Ahtisaari, the former Finnish president, at the signing ceremony of the Aceh peace agreement in Helsinki in 2005, if I recall correctly. Again, quite an impressive success story, quite a big success for also EU mediation capability, and sort of seizing the moment. There was this devastating tsunami in Indonesia, Boxing Day 2004, which to some extent I think readjusted people's priorities a little bit, and both the government of Indonesia as well as the Free Aceh movement were prepared to begin serious negotiations, and the EU basically was ready to facilitate these negotiations, help parties come together, and Ahtisaari became sort of the key broker here. And I've decided to keep East Timor still as a success story with a question mark here, in particular because I think the problems that we have in East Timor at the moment have relatively little to do with the Australian-led intervention that we had between 1999 and 2002, which, as you can see from this pretty picture here, did really bring important elements of stability and security to East Timor. And what is going on right now is much more sort of factional infighting among the elites in East Timor, rather than a direct consequence of a failed or successful UN intervention. So what accounts for a successful intervention? Well, having resources available and committing them in a sustainable way always helps. To have leverage over the conflict parties is a good thing, and next time I will talk about intervention in the Western Balkans. I think that will become very clear. And you need leadership. I mean, in a way, you need somebody like Bill Clinton who can go to Kosovo and have a little boy on his knees and really sort of project a vision of democracy that also has some kind of a human face and gets people engaged. And you need to have skills. So you need to have leaders who actually know what they are doing, or at least who are able and willing to trust advisors who know what they are doing. And sometimes national interests do coincide with credible and successful interventions, and the agendas of conflict parties do at times converge, and it is important then to actually seize the opportunity, as I said earlier on in the case of Aceh. There are sometimes small windows of opportunity available where you can get parties together and make them sign a deal and then implement and operate an agreement. But you really need to be there at the time when it happens. If you have, like the European Union had in the past, a 7-month delay in making a decision and getting all the institutions on board, whether you can commit the 20,000 euros that it would take to fly a delegation over from somewhere to engage in meaningful negotiations. This can mean that after 7 months, nobody might really be alive there anymore, or you have massive escalation of violence, deterioration of the situation. So, in a sense, conflict resolution through international intervention very often also means that you do have a lot of luck involved. So sometimes you can have all the resources, all the commitment, all the skills and vision available. If there is not an opportune moment, then it is very, very difficult to really have a successful intervention. So now what about the future of intervention? Well, I already indicated that great power politics will continue to matter. So United States, EU, Russia, China, India, these I think are the major powers. Probably in Latin America, Brazil should be counted as well, and maybe in Africa, Nigeria or South Africa. But what these parties have on their agenda will determine the degree to which interventions will happen, the directions in which they will go, and the extent to which they will succeed. International terrorism, I think the important thing here to note is two things. On the one hand, terrorism really dominates the security agendas of governments around the globe now. But what has also happened is that sort of the Al-Qaeda type Islamic fundamentalists have been able to put their own agendas, graft themselves and their agendas onto a number of local conflicts, in particular those that involve Muslim minorities. So if you think of southern Thailand, Mindanao in the southern Philippines and so on and so forth. So they are really there with their global agendas and make it much more difficult in a way than to have a successful intervention. Domestic pressures, well, where do you invest limited resources? Into making homeland security more robust, your borders more or less penetrable, or do you have a proactive and relatively costly international conflict management policy? And finally, where do you put your resources? Towards symptoms, where you see relatively quick fixes that you can sell to your domestic constituencies at home, or do you really put it towards root causes of conflict, which very often take many, many years of sustained commitment and investment to really create situations in which conflict is either unlikely or can be resolved successfully. So bottom line is good examples, bad examples, and I think gradually we are getting to a situation in which international intervention becomes more accepted as a tool of conflict resolution, and B, over time will become more and more successful because important lessons can be learned from both past failures and past successes.
Dr. Wolf can be contacted by email at Stefan, spelt Stefan, at Stefanwolf, spelt StefAnWolff.com.